Before we get into today's story, I want to remind you that this is part 2 of a 2-part episode. If you haven't heard Thursday's episode yet, start there. This one picks up right where that one left off. We're replacing this week's bloopers to finish the story, and I think you'll agree it's worth it. Hey everybody, it's Ron. I want to finish telling you a story about business and how that story changed everything. The pencil is a simple thing. You can hold one even when your hand is weak. You can use one even when you can't speak. A man dying of throat cancer in a cottage at Mount McGregor, New York in the summer of 1885 can still hold a pencil, and Ulysses S. Grant held one for as long as he had left. He wrote at a table. He wrote propped up in chairs. He wrote through choking episodes that left him gasping, through days when the pain was bad enough that his doctor wasn't sure he would last the week. On good days, he produced 25 to 50 pages. Clear handwriting, sparse prose, the same directness that made his military orders models of clarity during the war now turned entirely toward the task of leaving something behind. He was writing against a deadline no doctor could push back and no publisher could extend. He had been ruined by the one thing he had trusted most, his own name in someone else's hands. Now he was doing the one thing that was entirely his own. The manuscript was 285,000 words. He finished the last page on July 18th, 1885. He died 5 days later. So what does it take to produce something of genuine and lasting value when your body is failing and your clock is running out? What happens when the last real asset a man has is his own story, and he decides to spend it completely? And how did the decision Grant made in the darkest year of his life produce one of the most commercially important books of the 19th century, leave his wife with nearly $500,000, and happen only because a friend refused to let him be cheated one more time? From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain the stories that changed business forever. Every date on the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, July 24th, we finished the one we started yesterday. This is the last campaign. Grant had not planned to write a book. He had resisted the idea for years, telling friends who suggested it that memoirs were the province of braggarts, and that his former military secretary, Adam Badeau, had already written 3 volumes about his generalship. It's all in Badeau, he would say, and consider the matter closed. What changed his mind was money, and what changed the terms was Mark Twain. After the collapse of the investment firm Grant and Ward, Ulysses had begun writing articles about Civil War battles for Century Magazine, a popular literary publication based in New York City. The articles paid modestly, but they did 2 things. They covered household expenses during the worst months, and they revealed to Grant that he could write, and write well. Century, recognizing what it had, offered Grant a contract to expand the articles into a full memoir. The terms were that they would give Grant 10% of the net proceeds. Mark Twain, who had been Grant's friend for years and had recently published Huckleberry Finn through his own company, Charles L. Webster and Company, heard about the Century contract and went directly to Grant. Twain looked at what Century was offering and was, in his own words, appalled. He told Grant that a book with his name on it would sell in numbers Century couldn't imagine, and he offered Grant 70% of net proceeds through subscription sales, a publishing model built on direct sales to buyers rather than retail distribution. Grant signed the contract. It was, as one historian later observed, one of the few good financial decisions Grant ever made. The writing itself was an act of sustained will that those who witnessed it struggled to describe adequately. Grant worked 5 to 7 hours a day through pain that would have stopped most men in the first week. The cancer had spread through his throat and jaw, making it difficult to speak, difficult to swallow, and eventually impossible to eat solid food. He communicated increasingly through written notes, which meant that even his conversations during this period were a form of the same work he was doing on the page. The manuscript was entirely in Grant's own handwriting. His son Frederick and a small team of assistants handled fact-checking and research, but the prose was Grant's, and the prose was remarkable. Twain, who had read more books than most people alive, compared the Memoirs to Julius Caesar's Commentaries on the Gallic Wars. Military historian John Keegan would later call it the most revelatory autobiography of high command to exist in any language. In June 1885, with the cancer in its final stages, the family moved to a borrowed cottage in the Adirondacks at Mount McGregor, New York, where the air was cooler and the setting quieter. Former Confederate generals made their way to the cottage to pay their respects. Friends came and went. Grant kept writing. By the end, he couldn't speak at all, and he left a written note for his doctor that read, "A verb is anything that signifies to be, to do, to suffer. I signify all three." He completed the manuscript on July 18, 1885, and he died 5 days later. Mark Twain did not wait for the mourning to subside before deploying the machine he had built. He deployed it because of the mourning. 10,000 agents fanned out across the northern United States carrying a script Twain had written, selling a 2-volume set at prices ranging from $3.50 to $12 depending on the binding. Many of those agents were Union veterans who showed up at their neighbors' doors in their old uniforms, carrying a book written by the man who had led them through the war, offered for sale in the weeks immediately following his death. The emotional logic was nearly impossible to resist. About 350,000 sets were sold. Julia Grant received approximately $450,000 in royalties during the first 3 years of its publication, the equivalent of more than $16 million today. The personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant have never gone out of print. They are taught in military academies, studied by historians, and read by generals. The man who failed at farming, debt collecting, real estate, and investment banking left behind a book that multiple generations of critics have placed among the finest military autobiographies ever written in any language by any commander. The mechanism we're looking at across both of these episodes is worth naming very plainly. Grant's name was his primary asset for most of his adult life, and every time he placed it in other people's hands, they used it for their own purposes and left him with nothing. The one time he kept the asset entirely for himself, controlled how it was used and what it said, and deployed it through a partner who protected his interest rather than exploiting them, he produced something that outlasted everything that had been taken from him. Like much of his later war history, his last campaign was the one he ran entirely on his own terms. It was also the one he won. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History. the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to actually understand business better without the fluff or the buzzwords or the MBA language, start by visiting us at businessdailypodcast.com.